Right. I'm actually only presenting because there was an empty slot, and I thought, okay, I can fill that, and I thought to actually talk about a work that was done a while ago. I presented this work actually 2 years ago at the ICSI conference in Lausanne, and then forgot all about it. But now we have an invitation to submit it to a special issue. And okay, I thought I'll use this talk to really get my head around it all again, and to sort of kickstart writing this paper in the next couple of weeks. Deadline is the end of the month. So, all right, and you only see my name there, but I really want to make clear that this is really the data were collected by Courtney von Hippel. I think she's joining us here today, which is great. And Courtney very kindly sort of included some of the measures in a longitudinal survey that she conducted. I'll talk about that later. And so that made it all possible. But also in this research will be involved Kat, Alex, Nick, Tegan, Sarah. I hope I don't forget anyone. Okay, so just get started. The idea is really to look at physical activity, being part of sports groups, groups more generally, and how that relates to depression and anxiety. And that is a straightforward sort of social cure story that many of you will be familiar with. So as a bit of background, if you just feel a little bit blue and a little bit down, and start Googling what you need to do to get on top of your sort of depressive symptoms, very quickly you will get all of these you come across all of this sort of articles that would tell you, look, what you need to do is just get out and engage in some physical activity, because that is really good for your mood, fights off depression, lowers anxiety, etc., etc. Or this one from Science News, very clear, sports, physical activity help against depression. And so the discussion actually very quickly, if you go online, is not really about whether sports is good for you, for your depression. Very quickly, that is, it seems to be assumed that that is the case. So the question then turns to what kind of sport do you need to do to help fight it? So this last article there is this last header. What kind of exercise do you need to do? And this author is saying, here's a list of my 5 favorite physical activities for beating depression. And just out of interest, what they mention is boxing, yoga, kayaking, hiking, or running. And so I hope that you do a few of those. But look, very quickly, when you Google a bit more, then you see that there is others who also say, oh yeah, engaging in sports, being active, physically active is good for you. But here it's very clear that what do you need to do? Well, first of all, dance or Zumba or cycling, yoga, Pilates, badminton, swimming. So a completely different list, except for yoga, of course. So that is really what seems to be the debate. If you go online and just sort of want to get some information how to deal with your depressive symptoms. And this is not just in sort of some sort of popular sort of media that you have access to. There's also a fair bit of literature on it. So again, here, the assumption that, well, engaging in physical exercise is good for you. And then the question is, should you be running or should you be weightlifting? And how does that compare to control? And I just sort of thought to put this one up. I thought it was an interesting study here by Doyne et al., who had 40 women who had minor depressive symptoms, and they were randomly assigned to an 8-week running or weightlifting, a non-aerobic condition, or in a list control. I go over with my cursor so you can follow. So they assess them for depression, 2 time points or 3 time points, And then that is compared to a control condition. And what they find is results were remarkably consistent across measures. Both exercise conditions significantly reduced depression compared to the waitlist control condition, right? So, okay, it doesn't really matter what you do as long as you're active. But it is interesting if you start to look a bit more about what exactly they did in those treatment conditions and what did they do in the waitlist control. So this is the text. I don't expect you to read all of that, but I just highlighted a few things that I thought were interesting. So the subjects in the experimental conditions, in the two active conditions, were advised to attend 4 exercise sessions per week. And in that session, they do lots of exercises, and there is one instructor there to do all of that with them. Yeah, so it's pretty intense. So you're meeting quite often with this instructor. Heart rate is monitored, and the same happens actually in a running condition and a weightlift condition. But compare that to the waitlist control, where all that really happens is that measurements are taken at 4 and 8 weeks. Otherwise, there is no interaction with anyone from the research team, so there's no social element to any of it. Okay, so that's interesting, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. So yeah? Oh, anyone? Okay. No one is saying anything. So that's interesting because, yes, what these participants do in the experimental conditions is they're being active, but also they seem to have a much more social experience. All right. But if you actually accept that physical activity is a way to combat depression, then it's not surprising that a lot of sort of practical advice and lots of guidelines that you may come across is saying, look, so how do you combat depression? Then that means you need to engage in physical activity. So this is, for instance, what the National Collaborating Centre for Mental Health in the UK is recommending. And you will actually online again find many other sort of flyers like this one by the Department of Sports and Recreation, by the Government of Western Australia. Also here, physically active, that is connected to mental health, and you can see lots of little tips of what you need to do to improve your mental health. Okay, and the reason why that would be, well, there are a few sort of clear physical reasons why physical activity would be good for you. On the one hand, if we're physically active, we have the release of endorphins. That's a natural antidepressant. We also have the release of serotonin. This one was one that I'd never heard of, but I find it interesting. Thermogenic hypothesis. When we're active, our body temperature goes up, and as a result, we relax some of our muscles, and that helps us to relax. And it is also the case, of course, that exercise distracts us from all the issues that we're facing. And some forms of exercise are directly trying to, are working on helping us to relax and targeting depressive symptoms more directly, you could say. But it's not just, I have to be fair and say it's not just that all these self-help sites that they actually focus on the physical triggers. They also really talk about why physical activity is actually good for you, because it does all these, it is associated with emotional benefits. First of all, you gain confidence. Right? If we're active, then we also feel that we're doing something good. We're meeting goals. We feel even perhaps better about our appearance. We get more social interaction. We interact with others often when we engage in physical activity, and also we cope in a more healthy way with challenges that come our way. So rather than opening a bottle of wine, you just sort of engage in another way to get on top of your issues. But of course, the second one is the one that is most interesting from a social cure perspective. The notion that when we are physically active, we often do so with others. It's an opportunity to engage with others socially. Okay. Right, so this is really everything you can find when you just go online and have a bit of a look about the connection between physical activity and health. But there's also a vast literature on this, and that is of course important, because to what extent is all of this intuitive stuff, to what extent is it true? And there's a lot there, and I had quite a lot of fun actually going through it. It's quite interesting to go into a field that you have no background knowledge in whatsoever, and to try and get a bit of an idea what the state of the field is. Biddle, as I understand it, has done an awful lot in this field. And in one of their reviews, they summarize the findings by saying, well, physical activity has potentially beneficial effects for reduced depression, but the evidence base is limited. Intervention designs are low in quality, and many reviews include cross-sectional studies. Physical activity interventions have been shown to have a small beneficial effect for reduced anxiety, but the evidence base is limited. And that's also a bit what I felt when I went through it all, is that there's a lot of cross-sectional research out there. That's not necessarily a problem, but it may be a problem here because you have also studies that show bidirectionality, where physical activity reduces self-reported depression, but it's also the case, of course, that if you have relatively high levels of depression to start with, you're also less likely to engage in physical activity. And normally that's not really a problem to acknowledge that there is bidirectionality, but in particular, if you're looking at interventions, this becomes an issue. Which one is the more sort of dominant pathway, because that determines, of course, what you need to do. Do you need to, stimulate physical activity, or do you need to help people to, with depressive symptoms, to overcome all sorts of barriers for them to engage in activities, which could be physical activity? So that is a bit of an issue, and there were indeed lots of low quality studies out there where there's a lot of cross-sectionally where people are asked about their depressive symptoms, and also self-reported how much they are actually physically active. Yeah. In a more updated review that Biddle and colleagues did, again talking about the empirical link between physical activity and depression, I thought this quote was very interesting too. So they say, while the field has expanded considerably over the past 30 to 40 years, it remains replete with simplistic statements and lacks a more nuanced approach that recognizes its inherent complexity. For example, it is common to see assertions in national guidelines in educational contexts that physical activity is essentially good for young people, without recognizing that positive mental health benefits may depend on the experience of physical activity and the context it takes place in. And you can see that I highlighted the word context, because I guess that's, of course, from our point of view, that would be the essential bit. Yes, it's one thing to engage in physical activity, but do you do it on your own, or do you do it with others? And what is the broader context in which this takes place? Okay, before going into the study, I just wanted to talk about one study in particular that I read earlier this week that I found quite intriguing, because this is one of the few randomized controlled trials getting around some of the issues that, of course, all that cross-sectional research is suffering from. And I just thought to walk you through what they find, because I think that again points to something I want to talk about later. So in this study, they had 49 female volunteers, moderate depressive symptoms, quite young. And what they had was they let them take part in a group-based exercise regime of 8 weeks. And they had a control condition. That control condition was actually going to do the exercise regime 8 weeks later, right? So it's just a wait list control. And they did find that in self-reported depressive symptoms in the exercise group, they were reduced. But also they found that depressive hormonal response was lower for the group-based exercise group than the control. Yeah, so they also had some very nice sort of physiological evidence for that. Aside from the fact that the exercise group got much fitter actually than the control group. But as you actually look at what they had to do, is that the physical exercise intervention was a group jogging exercise class. So it's group-based. Lots of participants come together. And it's pretty intense. It's 50 minutes for 5 days per week for 8 weeks. So just count that up. That's say 40 hours over a period of 8 weeks. That's pretty intense, where you actually meet on a nearly daily basis with others. And so when they actually looked at the self-reported depression scores, what I found interesting, that they made a note that the reduction in self-reported depression was mainly due to shifts on scores on particular items. And they had to do with depression affect, and the other one was relation with others. So people felt that they, after the 8 weeks, had better relations with others. They didn't find it for positive affect items and those tapping somatic symptoms. So again, actually, we find this reduction in depression, but that mostly comes because people feel that they have better connections with others. Right? So you can probably see where I'm going with this. All right, then finally, there are also lots of meta-analysis in this field, and I just thought to mention two. All of them are actually finding, some positive relationships between physical activity and depression, but they're modest and sometimes weak. And a couple of them are also talking about moderations. So for instance, Carter is most explicitly about that. They, on the basis of their analysis and the analysis of moderation, they recommend that group-based and supervised light to moderate intensity exercise activities could be effective, but they really emphasize that group-based activities are superior, and also activities that are supervised by someone. So you meet up with someone when you're exercising. Okay, so that raises the question really, in all of this work, there seem to be positive effects of physical exercise, but at times that is confounded with that whether it's also meeting up with others when you actually exercise. So it raises the question whether it's the group, the exercise, or a bit of both that does all of the positive work here. And of course, social identity analysis is very interested in especially that group-based aspect of these positive effects. And this is probably not the group where I have to talk very long about that. So just in very short, the notion that important parts of who we are as individuals is derived from the memberships of the groups that we belong to, and in particular that group memberships provide us with a psychological resource, they provide us with social support, meaning in life, purpose in life, etc. And all of those psychological resources make us stronger and make us better able to cope with particular challenges that life throws our way. And if you accept that group memberships are a psychological resource, then it automatically follows that the more of those resources you have, the better off you are. So there's a the more the merrier effect, where if you have 2 groups, that should be better for your mental health than 1. Having 3 groups is better than 2, etc. But, and this is an important sort of qualification, it's not just the more the merrier. We've theorized quite sort of strongly that these positive effects of multiple group memberships are only unlocked when people identify with the groups that they belong to, and also if these multiple groups are compatible with each other. So if you have many groups, but it is difficult for you to be a member of one group as well as a member of the other group, then you don't get these beneficial effects, right? So groups have to fit with each other for them to really contribute positively to your mental health. All right, let me just talk a little bit about the data. So as I mentioned, Courtney was kind enough to let us include measures in a longitudinal survey that she conducted among all of the cohorts, all of the students from the Anglican Church Grammar School. It's also known as Churchy. I like their slogan, Churchy, the making of men. Well, like is probably the wrong word, but interesting slogan. So what was done actually, these boys, they completed all of the measures in 2014 and again exactly a year later in 2015. And it was great, of course, they did it in the school. It was easy to connect all of the responses. So you only lose year 12, but otherwise there's really good sort of, there's a low attrition rate. So just in terms of the questions that we asked here, it was really about looking at depression reduction and anxiety reduction over time. Interestingly, there were questions there. There was an assessment of their fitness levels at time 1. Well, is that reducing depression and anxiety over time? Is it engaging in multiple sports at time 1 that predicts long-term depression and anxiety? Is it belonging to multiple sports groups that people identify with and that are compatible? Or is it belonging to any type of group? So it doesn't have to be sports groups, it could be any type of group. And again, that people identify with and that are compatible. And so this is the way that the 4 types of analysis that I will report now to sort of show you what is actually happening in this sample. As I said, almost all of the boys took part at time 1. We lost year 12, of course, the year after, but still were able to connect, the data of 558 boys on the key dependent measure, which is the HADS, the depression and anxiety measure. If we look at depression and anxiety over time, you can see that time 1, time 2, for anxiety, there is a bit of a decline. For depression, it's a marginally significant decline. I'm not sure why that would be. I also don't really think it's all that important for our purposes. It could just be one was a bit, one survey was a bit closer to an exam period or not. But again, we do have a little bit of variability and between the 2 time points for the whole sample. And of course, what we're trying to look at is within the boys, how their anxiety and depression develops over that 1 year time. Okay, so first let's focus on the fitness question. Is it really, if you're physically fit at time 1, that in and of itself is a contributor to depression and anxiety over time? And it was really interesting that all of these boys at time 1 did these tests that they were really sort of measured in terms of speeds, sprints, agility, jumping ability, pull-ups, sit-ups, etc. So of all of those scores, we simply standardize them and we turn it into one score. And so this one Z score, the question is really, how does it correlate with anxiety and depression? You can see that, yes, if you have high levels of fitness at time 1, that is associated with lower anxiety, lower depression at time 1, and also lower anxiety and depression at time 2. So, okay, that looks promising. But of course, we're interested in change over time. So if you look at fitness time 1, how it connects to, how it predicts anxiety at time 2, while you actually control for anxiety at time 1, you can see that there's no significant effect. And the same happens when you actually look at the effect of fitness on depression. So, okay, it's good to be fit, and that is a sign of low levels of anxiety and depression, but it doesn't help us to predict long-term changes in anxiety and depression. And that is, of course, what we want, to really tackle a little bit of that directionality issue. Okay, well, perhaps it is engaging in multiple sports, and that is really what you need to do. So it gets closer to this social cure thinking, that all we need to do is join many groups, many sports groups, and then the beneficial effects of being physically active will come to the fore. What we had here was the boys were asked to tick 18 different activities that were provided in the school, whether they, yes or no, took part in it. And this analysis was limited to all the different type of activities that were provided that relate to sports. Yeah, and I think there was chess in there, but I dropped that because that's of course not a physically active activity. Here actually you don't see that, so what we did for the boys simply add up the number of boxes that they ticked, so how many sports that they were actively doing in school. Here you only see that the total number of sports, the more sports groups that they took part in, was related to lower depression at time 1. But again, if you start to look over time, you don't see that sports group participation is related to anxiety or depression over time, especially not when you control for time 1 scores. Yeah? So here we don't really see a more the merrier effect simply by, okay, yes, I take part in particular sports groups. So there is a bit more, we need to dig a bit deeper, and that is something we could do with another measure that the boys completed. This was a measure that some of you will be very familiar with. The boys were asked to list up to 6 groups that they belong to, and it could be any groups. And they were asked for each of these groups to indicate how important that group was, how well the group fits with other groups. So you can have 3 scores, calculate from here the number of groups you belong to, and that is a bit of a limited measure because they could only list up to 6 really. So and then we also average for these groups that they measured, that they indicated how important were these groups, and also how well these groups fit with each other. That was another score. So looking at this, again, I'll just show you what happens longitudinally. Cross-sectionally, we do find that there's good correlations. No, actually not for this measure. Sorry, I have to correct myself here. What we find here is, again, that if you simply look at multiple sports groups that the boys belong to, we don't really find that it predicts anxiety over time if we control for anxiety at time 1. And also in terms of depression, not much of a predictor here. So number of groups doesn't predict the importance of the sports groups listed doesn't predict, and also how fitting the sports groups are. For anxiety, it actually didn't predict. Here you actually do see that the more fitting that the sports groups are, the lower the level of depression over time. Okay, so we're getting a little bit more sort of in terms of predictive power, but it is pretty limited still. Okay, then we just looked at what do the exits do. This is also a measure that many of you will use, just a very general measure to these boys, to what extent they are a member of lots of different groups. And it can be any type of multiple groups. If you look at the correlations, you can see that now we actually start to see something that seems to have a bit more to it. The axes correlate with lower anxiety time 1, lower depression time 1, lower anxiety time 2, and lower depression time 2. But again, the crucial question is, of course, if this holds across time. And luckily it does. So if I belong to many groups, any group at time 1, if that is associated with lower anxiety at time 2, even when controlling for anxiety at time 1. So that looks promising. And actually we did, similar sort of effect when we look at depression. So again, that looks promising. And one thing that we then did is go back to this measure that I showed you before, because initially we simply focused on the groups that the boys listed that were related to sports. But, all of these boys also mentioned lots of other groups that they belonged to and that were non-sports related or not physical activity related. So again, we rerun that analysis now, taking account of all the groups that the boys mentioned, an important score for all of these groups and a fit score for all of these groups. And what you find then is number of groups doesn't really do all that much. Again, that could be due to the fact that there is only up to 6 groups that could be listed. But you can see that the importance of these groups and also the fit of these groups mattered when we predict anxiety over time, even when we control for anxiety at time 1. And a similar sort of effect if we look at depression. The effects for depression are a little bit stronger, you see, as you can see. So number of groups, the more groups that they belong to is not significantly leading to a reduction in depression, but the more important the groups are that are listed, the lower the depression at time 2, the higher the fit of the groups that are listed, the lower the depression at time 2. So, okay, just summing up, and I only have one very brief summary here. I run a bit out of energy in sort of really drawing out the implications, but I hope we can perhaps do that in a discussion. So what I think that the findings show is that when I'm explaining anxiety and depression over time, it is not so much fitness. Okay, fitness is important to sort of get a bit of an indicator of how well someone is, but it doesn't help us to explain changes in anxiety and depression over time, nor does the fact whether the boys engaged in multiple sports. That didn't really do anything. It's also not so much the number of sports groups, groups that are physically active, that one belongs to and identifies with. So beneficial effects of being part of a group were not limited to sports groups. Instead, it was really belonging to any type of multiple group. So whether people identified with a group and whether that group was compatible with all the other groups that one belonged with, that seemed to matter most when we want to explain depression and anxiety over time. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.